Hello everyone and welcome back to the Cozy Corner. My name is Lee and this is my library, so grab a mug of something yummy and settle in for some talk of books. It is time to do my January wrap-up where I talk about all the books that I read in the month of January. It was a great reading month. It was a very well-rounded reading month. We had some good ones, we had some not so good ones, and we had a nice mix of everything in between. So I do have 9 books in total to get through, so I am going to move kind of quickly through them. So I will skip sort of the summary of the books and just give you a brief overview and then my thoughts of what I liked and what I didn't like. Because we had some real bangers in here, and if I don't watch myself, I could go and go for forever. So without further ado, let's talk about the one-star book I read in the month of January. My one star was Dangerous Wonder by Michael Yaconelli, and I know there are going to be several people that are disappointed that I did not rate this book higher than I did. I had major issues with this book, both content-wise and theologically, faith-wise. Basically, this is about how to recapture your childlike faith in the midst of faith practices that sort of stifle you as an adult. And if you recapture your childlike faith, you're more likely to experience joy as an adult when life is crazy busy around you. In concept, or in theory, that concept should have worked. And I think had this book been written like Michael Yaconelli's personal testimony, it would have made a bigger impact. But he argued throughout this whole book that this was the only way to live your faith life. He had some gross misinterpretations of scripture. This book read like this man had gone through something that made him so bitter about his faith and his calling to be a pastor for a community, that he was saying, none of that matters. This is the only way that you can connect with God as an adult. I am so glad that I did not read this book when it was assigned to me, this was given to us as a staff when we were supposed to do this as a book study, which we didn't do. And I am so glad that I did not read this book when I did, because I think this is supposed to be sort of a self-help book for people going through a crisis of faith. I would not give this to a kid. I would not give this to a new Christian. I would not give this to anyone who is struggling with a crisis of faith, because there are discussion questions in here that are not okay for any sort of resolution or resolving of a crisis of faith. This is one man's testimony. It is an individual relationship with Jesus. No one else's relationship should look like yours, because it is your story with Jesus. We all worship one God, but we all have an individual relationship with Jesus, and you cannot make your testimony the hard and fast rule as to how other people should live your life. I just had so many issues, and I answered the discussion questions to a point because I wanted to give this book a fair review, but I stopped answering them, and I just needed to get through it because it was not good. And so because I've written in this, and because I don't want this falling into the hands of someone who is having a crisis of faith and it would read damaging material like this is getting pitched. Moving on to the 2-star book for the month of January, that is Death by Hot Apple Cider by Alex Erickson. This is another installation in the Bookstore Cafe Murder Mystery series where we follow Chrissy, who is one of the proprietors of the Bookstore Cafe. And like most Cozy Murder Mystery series, murders happen all the time in this small little town. And so a man who has been protesting her bookstore and the library for gross indecency, basically saying that all of the books that the bookstore sells and the library owns are what's causing all of the bad stuff to happen to their town, and that they need to be abolished. And things escalate. There's a lot of propaganda, a lot of public property defacement, vandalism, arguments. Anyway, this man winds up dead, poisoned by the hot apple cider that Chrissy's cafe makes. And so, of course, which means that she is a prime suspect in this murder mystery. 2 stars. I know it can sometimes be a little alarming to people, but I give 2 stars for books that are enjoyable but not moving. So this was what I would expect from a cozy murder mystery. Easy to read, nothing super earth-shattering. Just another good installment that moved really quickly in a really good cozy murder mystery series. I had no real issues with it. I liked the delivery of who did it. I liked the concept of like banned books being the subject for a book, and propaganda and the conservative movement, diving into how those two correlate. All takes place over Thanksgiving. There's some cute romance in here. I will say though, not my favorite romantic couple in cozy murder mysteries. I have other favorites, but I had no real issues with this. Good plot, good murder. That's it. Moving on to the 3-star books. Of course, we have the latest update of the Bookstore Cafe Murder Mystery series, which is Death by French Roast, also by Alex Erickson. I liked this one. This is one of my favorites of the series, which is why I gave it 3 stars, which is a good book everybody should read. If you like cozy murder mysteries, this is a really unique take on a cozy murder mystery series. So again, we follow Chrissy. Chrissy's neighbor dies, and we discover as she's helping her neighbor's niece go through the stuff in her house that her brother was murdered a long time ago, and no one knew who did it. But she finds out that this man had dated one of her friends, and there was a huge age gap between them, and it kind of rattled the town, and so this man had stirred the pot for a lot of people and of course wound up dead. And so it's a cold case, and that is not something that I have read in a cozy murder mystery before, and I really thought it worked. It worked so well in that it was a small town, like closed set, a lot of secrets that were being dug up, a lot of new characters, a lot of prejudices, and the fact that there had been a murderer living in this town for so long. I love it. I love that concept. It reminded me a lot of Agatha Christie's 5 Little Pigs, or I think the English title is A Murder in Retrospect, where it's a similar concept of Hercule Poirot's investigating a cold case, and there are all of these characters that helped cover up this death, but the real killer wasn't caught. Someone else was executed instead. No one's executed in this, but it was a really interesting concept. I loved the reveal of who did this one. I think it was really fascinating, and there were quite a few misdirects in here that were executed really well. Yeah, I genuinely enjoyed this book. Plus it's just like that good loose floppy paperback, which just makes it so much more satisfying. Moving on in the 3 stars. I have 2 that aren't with me because one was an ebook, one was an audiobook. The ebook was While Justice Sleeps by Stacey Abrams. This was recommended to me based off of the 12 books in 12 months, where your friends recommend one of their favorite books for you to read. This was kind of a last minute decision that I had to do because I just kind of wanted to add a sort of another element of diversity into what I was reading, I guess. So While Justice Sleeps was recommended to me by my friend Kirsten, so thank you, Kirsten. And it follows the story of Avery Keene, who is a lawyer attached to a Supreme Court justice. And the justice goes into a coma after ranting and raving about this particular conspiracy involving the president. And it's discovered that Avery has been made or has been given power of attorney over her boss, which is very alarming because they've had maybe 2 or 3 conversations of any substance outside of work stuff. And if you don't know what power of attorney is, basically means that she has control over money, estate, the right to live. She can pull the plug on him anytime she wants. She can look at all of his personal documents, i.e. his will, and basically she's completely floored. And so she is launched into this investigation of solving the mystery of why was he poisoned? Oh, he was poisoned, but that's not a spoiler. That happens right away. What's this conspiracy? How does it involve her? That kind of thing. I really, really liked this book. I think the writing is beautiful. I think Stacey Abrams has such a command over dialogue. She had very clear characters. It's the kind of dialogue that matched a high intellect book. Very witty, great one-liners. There was no dead space in talking. It was just beautiful. I think the reason why this didn't get a higher rating from me was because I described this to someone as it was like there was the tension music of a thriller movie playing in the background all the time, but I didn't know why I was supposed to be tense. I had no idea what was happening. It was such a high cerebral concept. It reminded me of a genius professor trying to explain a complicated concept to someone who has no idea about the subject. It just didn't quite bridge the gap between casual reader of this book and someone who likes legal medical thrillers. Didn't quite bridge that gap, but I think the plot, concept, and idea was very interesting. 2/3 of the way through the book, it took a weird Squid Games turn. I would not have thought this had I not seen Squid Games, but there's a scene in that book where I was like, that's scene for scene what happened in Squid Games. That was insane. So I think overall the plot was really good, which is why I would recommend it to anyone who likes legal thrillers, because I think this was a really unique idea. The ending was a little dissatisfying, but overall, short of me not understanding half the book because legal thrillers aren't my thing, it was enjoyable, and I thought it was a really unique concept. And the other 3-star that I don't have with me is Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion. It is a collection of 12, I thought it was 6, it was actually 12, of her works basically summarizing her inspiration for starting writing, some of her first things, her stories of attempting to be published, why she writes, how she writes, her creative process. Her writing style is very different from what I am used to. It is very point blank. It is only observational. There is no hidden meaning or layered metaphor in how she writes. It is just an observation of fact, which is her interpretation of it or her thoughts behind it, which she says in her writing. And because I exist primarily in the world of fantasy, where often a lot of it is extended metaphor or double meaning, it was a real struggle for me to sort of let go of that part of my brain and just listen. I found myself getting distracted easily, and there were some of them where I'm like, I got nothing out of listening to that, but we can't like them all. Which is ultimately why I gave it 3 stars, because it's a really interesting origin story to a very well-known and much beloved female author. But you can't like everything. I think my particular favorites of hers were about why she writes and how she writes. I really liked the one about her processing through her higher education and the struggle she went through with that, and her story about querying or getting herself published. And I think that was really nice because it was a little bit of solidarity of, you're going to get people who don't like what you write or say you write beautifully but it's not what we want, and what that can do to your psyche as a writer, and changes how you do things. I really do want to read one of her novels. I think it would be interesting to read that type of writing in a longer form narrative. So I'm by no means never going to read her again. I just don't know if I'll pick her up anytime soon because it wasn't necessarily something that fully captured my interest, but I still enjoyed it, so I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Oh, and I did forget one other one that was 3 out of 5 stars, and that is Other People's Rejection Letters by, I want to say his name is Bill Shapiro. I don't have it in front of me. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Basically, it's just a compilation of all of these rejection letters that people sent to him or he collected, as sort of a commiseration moment of, we've all been there. And so I really liked, speaking of Joan Didion's rejection letters, the ones pertaining to writers who were querying and received dozens of rejection letters from publishing houses, big name authors, and artists who kept submitting their work to galleries and kept getting rejected, and the toll that that can take on your psyche and your creativity, but also how it allows you to push and to reevaluate and to re-engage why you're doing what you're doing. It was really nice to read that and to take some encouragement from that. I think actually probably the most interesting one was a letter that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote his daughter, basically saying you are empty-headed and spoiled, so therefore I'm cutting you off. I don't find you particularly interesting, so you are no longer receiving any support from me. And I was just, that was the most beautifully written rejection letter that I've ever seen. I read that in an evening, that book. It was a really nice palate cleanser between some of the stuff that I had been reading. And yeah, it was just a great little breath of fresh air. I hadn't planned on reading it, but I picked it up and there you go. And the last 3-star read on my list is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Speaking of artists who have, or authors who I've never read before, this is my first Margaret Rogerson. This follows the story of Elizabeth, who is basically a caretaker for magical books. A book gets stolen. She has to partner up with a wizard whom she believes is bad because that's been indoctrinated in her, Nathaniel Thorne, and they partner up to solve this conspiracy of magical books being stolen and used for evil. So an anti-magic person and a magic person have to work together, which is just a great fantasy trope. I really enjoyed this book. It was a very quick read. I went through it very quickly. I thought it was a really unique concept. I loved the talking book library element, which, now that I think about it, also happened in another book, which I'll talk about in a minute. One thing that is made me wrestle with this book and why I ultimately didn't rate it higher than I did is because this is not a series. This is a standalone fantasy, which you do not see often in the fantasy world. And Margaret Rogerson, I looked this up, but Margaret Rogerson later said that was her intent. She did not plan to make this a sequel. This was a standalone fantasy novel. And maybe it's because my brain has been trained to think about fantasy in multiple installments, or I expect delivery of things to kind of take that form of a little more drawn out in terms of character development and world building. I felt like it missed the mark. If this was supposed to be a standalone, there were some things in here that I thought were too condensed or something was missing. It was a beautiful book, but there were things like Elizabeth's boss or mentor at the beginning of the book. I wish she had had more character development, or more explanation as to who she was. I thought the relationship between Elizabeth and Nathaniel was a little rushed. We got one moment where Nathaniel admits that he's bisexual. And it was just a brief mention and we were meant to go on, which is fine, right? Acceptance is great. But I think particularly because this is a YA book, there was a missed opportunity to do a little bit of processing of what that looks like. Great cliffhanger at the end. I really liked the ending, but I wanted more. And I kind of found myself thinking that as I read along, even before I knew that this wasn't going to be a series. And I feel like if you're going to be a standalone fantasy novel, you got to hit the mark on all of those things. And I know for a lot of people she did. But for me personally, who has spent much time in long-form fantasy and knows the satisfaction of delivery in those particular concepts, that's a hard thing to condense. And so on the whole, I think she did really well in doing that, but I wanted more. I did. I want to read more about Elizabeth and Nathaniel and Silas and this world that they live in. I don't want to challenge her authority over her books because she can write what she wants to write, but I would love more. And I think maybe a prequel about who Elizabeth's boss was, that would be good. I would read that because she sounds like an awesome lady. Moving on to my 4 stars. Unfortunately, I did not have a 5-star read this month, but that is okay because there are at least one coming in the month of February. But the first 4-star book that I read in January was Magic for Liars by Sarah Gale. I loved this book. I thought it was really unique, a very interesting concept. It was unlike anything I'd ever read before. This follows the story of Ivy Gamble, who is a non-magical person. She's a private investigator, and she gets hired to investigate a murder at her sister's school where she teaches that is all about magic. Her sister is magical, Ivy is not, and so there's some tension there. She goes to solve this murder of a professor there, and it's like Gossip Girl meets The Order, you know? That kind of vibe. I did pull this out of my dark academia jar, and there was a little bit of those vibes. I think probably one of my favorite things about this was the magic system. It was almost like horror movie type magic. Like, it was gross and pretty all at the same time. I thought the reveal of who did it was insane. I did not see it coming, which is rare. Really the only thing that prevented me from giving this 5 stars is that I don't know if I'll ever read this again. Again, this is a standalone. I don't think this is going to become a series. It was really well written. I loved Ivy as a narrator. She's not unreliable, but she's very jaded and twisted, and obviously has a lot of familial trauma between her and her sister, which led to some very interesting decisions that were made in this book. There's a little bit of romance. I do want to say that there are several trigger warnings in this book, so this might be a little bit of a spoiler, but there is some abortion trigger warnings, traumatic pregnancy, substance abuse, so just be careful and know that those things are in here. This one was ended, wow, sentence structure. This ended exactly the way that I really like books to end, with a full circle but bittersweet ending. I no longer, and maybe that's because I'm an adult and have lived more life than I did when I was 16, I don't like books that are very prettily wrapped up with a bow on top. The happy ending books, they have their time and place, but I genuinely am always more satisfied now with a book that has natural consequences for what happened in the book, a realistic ending based on what happened in the story, and I got that, and it was so good. I was a little emotional when this book ended. I thought it was a very sad ending, very fitting, but sad. I definitely think that I will read more from Sarah Gale. I really liked the concept, and I love this cover design. It's so stunning. Yeah, it took me by surprise how much I liked this book. So anyway, glad that I read this one later in the month and that we finished on a high. And then this one. I did not finish this book last in the month, but it was my favorite of the month, and I did not anticipate that happening. But the last 4-star book for the month of January was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas. Is anyone surprised? I don't know who would be or who wouldn't be. Oh, I will say, before I give my review of this book, I have read the second one by now, but after having read that book, it changes a little bit of what I thought originally about this book. So I'm going to do my best to give my thoughts about this book without having read the sequel, which I have. But this tells the story of Farah, who is trying to support her starving family. She goes into the woods and kills this wolf. Turns out she accidentally killed a fae, and so this other fae comes and basically says, you killed my friend, now I have to take you life for a life. That's how this works. And so as an opportunity to save her family and also to escape the burden of trying to provide for them, she leaves with him, Tamlin, and goes to the Spring Court, and it basically is discovered that there's this blight and evil villainess who is just iconic, and that she is a part of solving this curse to free the fairy people. I think the world building in here is great. The characters in here are excellent. The only 2 issues I had with this book at all was, one, I felt that the relationship between Farah and Tamlin was too insta-lovey. I kind of got that feeling, and I'm like, oh, that's too bad. I was hoping that this would be more, we would deal with more the issues of prejudice that both the humans and the fairies have against each other. We would deal more with the class system, the abuse, the slavery that happened in the past, the war. But it was really, the first half of the book was really focused on the relationship between Farah and Tamlin, and I was on board because I liked Tamlin. But I felt it was a little too quick for me. And then the other main issue that I had with this book is that there comes a point, and this isn't necessarily a spoiler, where Farah is sent away by Tamlin because the evil is getting bigger. Amarantha is getting more daring, and Farrah's life is at risk, and so Tamlin sends her away without explaining to her what her role was in trying to break the curse. She was the only option for breaking the curse, and she could have done it, but Tamlin sent her away. She wasn't given a choice, and Farrah up to this point had been a fiercely independent person, which I loved. I think Farrah was such a striking character because she was so fiercely independent and didn't take any crap. She was so assertive and dominant, which was so refreshing. In stereotypical damsel in distress fantasy, she was not that. She was the antithesis of that. But in this one instance, we got no satisfaction of her confronting Tamlin, which she had done up until this point, of saying, hey, I deserved to have a choice in this situation. Just because you love me doesn't mean you get to say, I want to keep you safe. You don't have any say in what I do with your life. We didn't get any of that. And I was so irritated because it was just a complete reversal of who Farrah's character was. And I was supremely unsatisfied with that. The second half of the book was very plot heavy. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was a brilliant concept. And we met Rhysand, which is just my kryptonite. Bad boys with a conscience. Ooh, we got maybe a handful of interactions with him, and I was sold, which sucked because I was really a Tamlin fan at the beginning. So I really liked the second half of the book. I thought it ended brilliantly. I said this in the vlog where I read this book, but I got major Beauty and the Beast vibes between Farrah and Tamlin in here. I thought that was a really interesting theme to pick up on. Don't know if that was intentional or not, but that's what I noticed. I will say, if you are hesitant about reading this book, please take all the things that I said with a grain of salt, because, and I will talk about this more when I do my What I Read in February video, all of my issues and questions and problems with this book were answered in the second. So all of my issues with it being insta-lovey, all of my issues with Farrah's seemingly vanished independence, all of that is answered and addressed in the second book. So I by no means am less satisfied with this book than I was before, because I think this is a brilliant start to the series. I can't necessarily say if I've read better fantasy, because I think it's so different from other things that I have read. It is very romance heavy, which is something that I haven't really read before. And so I'm having a hard time comparing it to other things. Sure, romance is an element of a lot of the fantasy that I read, but it's very rarely as spicy. And this is adult fantasy, and I haven't spent a whole lot of time in that subgenre. So I thoroughly enjoyed this. And the only reason why I didn't give this 5 stars is because I want to wait until I have read the whole series to sort of decide which are my favorites. The second one is definitely going to be one of my favorites. But I think because initially I had some of issues with the content in here is why I didn't give it 5 stars, but we'll see if that changes. This was just exactly what I needed this year. And that concludes the summary of what I read in January. So if you have read any of these books, I went a little hard against some what I know are favorites for some people. So if you've read any of these books and you agree with my thoughts or you don't agree with my thoughts, I would love to know what you think. So comment down below. Let me know if you read any of these for the first time in January as well, or if you have any recommendations based on those books for me to add to my TBR game that's sitting over here. And if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because it really does help me out and let me know what you guys want to see. As always, a huge thank you to the friends and family who have readily supported me along this journey. I can't wait to see what's on the next page. Cheers.